I was staring at her again. Jessica moved around the room, her laugh light and airy, the center of attention at our friend Matt's house. She was always in her element at these gatherings, fluent in small talk, easy with a joke, her eyes bright as they darted from person to person. I played my part, as always, nodding, smiling when necessary, but the truth was my mind had long since detached from the conversation. It was subtle what had started to bother me. At first, I thought it was just a natural shift in the rhythm of a marriage. We'd been together for 10 years, married for 7. People changed, but it wasn't the kind of change that came from the inevitable wear of time. It was sharper, more deliberate. And then there was Daniel. Matt's brother was always around, a fixture in our lives since the beginning. He was younger, more carefree, never quite settling down. The kind of guy who seemed too charming for his own good. I never paid much attention to him before. Not until I started noticing the way his hand lingered just a little too long on Jessica's shoulder when he laughed, or how she'd lean in close to whisper something to him when they thought no one else was paying attention. The first time I caught it, I brushed it off. What was I supposed to think? We all trusted each other, but then it kept happening. Small moments piling up in the back of my mind, heavy as stones. A touch that lasted a second too long. A shared smile that no one else was in on. I found myself watching her more closely now. At gatherings like this, she was always surrounded by people, her phone often in her hand, lighting up with notifications she'd glance at, then quickly tuck away. Vague answers when I'd ask about her day, more late nights working at her job. Something wasn't right. It was like trying to grab smoke, something slipping through my fingers, and yet I couldn't prove anything. But I could feel it, sitting there, pretending to listen to Matt ramble on about his latest trip. My mind kept drifting back to the growing distance between Jessica and me. The kind of distance that didn't announce itself, it crept in slowly, until one day you realized the person you thought you knew was becoming a stranger. "David, you all right, man?" Matt's voice cut through my thoughts. I blinked, realizing I'd been staring off into space. "Yeah, just tired. Long week," I lied, forcing a smile. I was getting good at that. Matt laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. "I hear you. But hey, it's the weekend now. Relax." I nodded, but I couldn't relax. Not with the nagging feeling in my gut, not with the way Jessica kept slipping off to the side with Daniel when they thought no one noticed. It was later that evening, as we were all gathered around the dinner table, that the spark of suspicion began to burn brighter. Jessica and Daniel were sitting directly across from me. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my eyes kept drifting to them, and my gut clenched when I caught it, her hand on his knee under the table for just a brief second. They were laughing at something Matt had said, but my mind zeroed in on that one touch, a touch that wasn't meant for anyone else to see. I swallowed hard, the room suddenly too warm. Had I imagined it? I told myself I had to be overreacting, that maybe I was just being paranoid. But then again, when you lived with someone for so long, you started to pick up on the changes. Even the ones they tried to hide. It was in the way she glanced at me, then quickly looked away. The way she had become more secretive with her phone, always keeping it face down on the counter. The sudden urgency of her work calls, always needing to stay late or take trips for meetings she never used to mention before. The cracks were widening, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. That night, after we got home, I watched her from the bedroom doorway as she stood by the window, her phone in hand, texting someone. The light from the screen lit up her face, and for a moment she looked almost peaceful, completely absorbed in whoever she was talking to. "Who are you texting?" I asked, my voice calm. She startled, quickly turning off the phone and tucking it into her pocket. "Oh, just Matt. He's asking about next weekend's plans." I nodded, though my stomach turned. I didn't ask any more questions. There was no point in pushing her yet. I needed more than just a feeling to go on. As she slid into bed beside me, I lay there staring at the ceiling, the weight of my suspicions pressing down like a heavy blanket. Sleep didn't come easy that night. My mind kept circling the same thoughts, the same scenes replaying over and over. The next morning, I decided to test something. Jess, you've been busy with work lately. Everything okay? I kept my tone light, casual. She didn't miss a beat. Yeah, just the usual chaos. Why? I shrugged. Just wondering. You've been staying late a lot more. She smiled, brushing it off like it was nothing. You know how it is, these projects just never seem to end. That's when I knew. She was hiding something. Her answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. But instead of confronting her right then and there, I stayed quiet. If I pushed too soon, she'd only retreat further into whatever lie she was living. No, I needed to be patient. I needed to watch. In the weeks that followed, I became a shadow in my own life, watching, waiting for cracks to appear in her story. The phone calls she took in hushed tones, the sudden trips out of town, always with some excuse about work. Her affection toward me felt mechanical, forced. The woman I once trusted with everything now felt like a stranger sleeping in my bed. It wasn't long before I noticed she wasn't the only one pulling away. Our friends, people we used to be close with, had started treating me differently. The subtle shift in their tones, the way conversations seemed to falter when I entered the room, like there was something unsaid that only I was out of the loop on. The passive aggression grew louder in my mind. Maybe it wasn't just Jessica. Maybe they all knew something I didn't. That realization hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just that she might be having an affair. It was that I was the only one who didn't see it coming. I wasn't going to be blind anymore. If she thought she could hide it from me, she was wrong. If our friends thought they could shield her from the fallout, they were wrong too. I wasn't going to sit back and let my life crumble around me while everyone else pretended nothing was happening. I was done watching. I was done waiting. The seeds of doubt had been planted, but now they were growing into something far more dangerous. Revenge. The unease continued to eat at me, gnawing away at every quiet moment. Jessica had grown more distant, her evasions more frequent, and the small excuses she once gave casually now held a tinge of guilt. Each day added another layer to my suspicions, a subtle tension that grew in the spaces between us. I began to notice how our lives had slowly become parallel. We lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, but our connection was severed. I didn't confront her, not yet. That would have been too easy, too direct, and I wasn't interested in emotional outbursts or empty denials. I wanted to be sure, to have the truth wrapped around her neck like a noose she couldn't escape. My mind was spiraling into places it hadn't gone before. I found myself studying her more closely, each movement, each glance, dissecting them with an intensity that made even mundane moments feel sinister. She had become more guarded, more careful about her phone, always keeping it close, locking it with a new password I couldn't guess. When I asked her where she was going, the answers were vague, slippery. I wasn't a fool. I didn't ask more than I needed to because I knew what I was looking for. I didn't need her explanations. What I needed was proof. So I started keeping track. Dates, times, the moment she was unreachable. It wasn't difficult. I'd always had a sharp memory. In fact, I made it seem like I wasn't even paying attention. That was the key, to be invisible in my observations, to let her think that I was still the David she married, oblivious and trusting. The one who didn't question her long hours, her sudden trips to see friends or handle last-minute meetings. But I was always watching now. I began tracking her phone using an app she didn't know I'd installed. It wasn't difficult. She left her phone charging in the kitchen one night, and I seized the opportunity. The next day, I knew exactly where she went when she said she was running errands. The little red dot on my screen showed her location, and it wasn't anywhere near the grocery store. Instead, it was on the other side of town, closer to where Daniel lived. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the red dot linger in that area for over an hour. I stared at it, waiting, as if I could will her out of there, hoping against hope that I was wrong. But she didn't move. The longer she stayed, the more certain I became. This wasn't some innocent visit. She was with him. Later that evening, I acted like nothing had changed. She came home, kissed me on the cheek, and started talking about her day as if everything was perfectly normal. I smiled, nodded, asked her how the store had been, all while picturing her in Daniel's arms, or worse, in his bed. The words she spoke faded into background noise as the reality of her betrayal slammed into me with each second that passed. I hadn't confronted her yet because I wanted more than just this app and her lies. I needed something tangible, something that she couldn't squirm out of. That was when I started to follow her. It felt strange at first, parking my car down the street, keeping a low profile as she drove off. But I was determined to know everything. It didn't take long to find out. A few days later, she left again, telling me she had to meet a client at the office. I waited until she was out of the driveway before starting my own car. I tailed her at a safe distance, my heart racing, my grip tight on the steering wheel as the miles passed. She didn't head to her office. Instead, she took a familiar route, a route I'd seen on the app days before. She was going back to Daniel. The rage simmered beneath my skin, but I kept it in check. This was no time to lose control. I parked 2 blocks away, close enough to keep an eye on her, but far enough that she wouldn't notice me. From the distance, I saw her car pull into Daniel's driveway. She got out, glanced around nervously as if expecting someone to be watching, and then hurried up the steps. The front door opened before she could even knock, and there he was, Daniel, smiling at her the way a man smiles at a woman he's been waiting for. They disappeared inside, the door shutting behind them with a finality that echoed in my chest. I sat there gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm up to that door, kick it in, and drag her out by her hair. I wanted to break Daniel's jaw with my fists, to scream at them both, to tear their perfect little world apart. But I didn't move. Not yet. I sat in my car for over 2 hours, watching the front of the house like a predator. Time crawled by, each second stretching into an eternity as I imagined what they were doing inside. I pictured every sordid detail, every whispered promise and shared secret. The images burned in my brain, but I couldn't look away. I needed to see how long she would stay. I needed to know how deep her lies went. When she finally emerged, her hair slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed, it took every ounce of strength I had not to leap out of the car and confront her right then and there. She looked around again, checking the street like she was afraid someone would see. Guilt was written all over her face. She knew she was doing something wrong, and yet she did it anyway. I followed her home, keeping my distance as she navigated the familiar streets. By the time we both arrived, I was no longer seething with anger. I was numb. The rage had solidified into something colder, something sharper. I knew what I had to do. I started gathering more evidence, building my case against her. The app wasn't enough. I needed something concrete, something that would leave no room for doubt. So I set up cameras in the house, hidden in places she wouldn't notice. I didn't care how long it took. I would wait, I would watch, and I would catch her in the act. I combed through her emails when she wasn't home, searching for anything that could tie her to Daniel more explicitly. It wasn't hard. People were careless, especially when they thought they had the upper hand. A message here, a photo there. Each discovery chipped away at whatever was left of the woman I thought I knew. The day I found the text messages, everything clicked into place. It was a simple exchange, one that might seem innocent if you didn't know the truth. "Meet me at the usual place," she had written. "I miss you." The response was instant. "Can't wait to see you again. Last time was amazing." There it was, the irrefutable proof I'd been waiting for, staring at me in black and white. They weren't just meeting, they were planning their next rendezvous, their next betrayal. The calm I'd been holding on to so tightly began to crack, but I forced myself to stay composed. I printed the messages, saving every scrap of evidence I could find. I needed to be thorough. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to dismantle her life, piece by piece, the way she had destroyed ours. She didn't know it yet, but her time was running out. That night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of the truth pressing down on me like a physical force. She lay beside me, already asleep, her breathing even and peaceful. How could she sleep so soundly? How could she lie there, so close to me, after everything she'd done? I had all the proof I needed, but the realization wasn't enough. I didn't just want to confront her. I wanted to watch her unravel, to see her squirm as everything she thought she'd hidden was laid bare. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about control. I wasn't going to be the one hurt by this. She was. I began making a list in my head, each step I would take to bring her down. Every move would be calculated, every detail precise. This wasn't going to be a moment of blind rage or impulsive revenge. No, it would be methodical, deliberate, and it would be devastating. In the following days, I tracked her every movement, cataloged her lies, and waited for the perfect moment. I watched her play the role of the perfect wife, laughing with our friends, kissing me on the cheek as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The David she thought she knew was gone. One evening while she was out again, supposedly with friends, I sat alone in my office staring at the printed messages in the video footage I had collected. The evidence sat in front of me, undeniable. It was almost laughable how easily she had fallen into my trap, how blind she was to the fact that her entire life was about to implode. And as I sat there, I felt something stir inside me, a dark satisfaction that I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about catching her anymore. It was about watching her world burn. I smiled, a slow, cold grin spreading across my face. This was only the beginning. Now that I had proof, the next step was clear. I needed a plan. The rage that had once burned hot had now cooled, settling into something far more dangerous: determination. I didn't want to confront her in some petty argument. That would be too easy for her, too temporary. I wanted to dismantle her life, piece by piece, in a way that she wouldn't see coming until it was too late. I spent hours sitting in my office, surrounded by the evidence I had gathered. The texts, the tracking data, the video footage. I had it all, but none of it was enough. Destroying Jessica wasn't just about exposing her affair. It was about stripping away the life she thought she had built, the one I had helped her create. I wanted to make her feel as powerless as she had made me feel. The first step was to isolate her. Jessica's entire world revolved around her friends, her social connections. She was the queen bee of our little circle, the one everyone gravitated toward. If I could turn her friends against her, that would be the beginning of her downfall. But I had to be careful. I couldn't just walk up to Matt and tell him that his brother was sleeping with my wife. No, that would tip my hand too early. I needed to sow doubt, to make him question Daniel's loyalty on his own. Matt was the key. Jessica had always been close with him, and I knew she confided in him more than anyone else. He trusted her, just like I had once trusted her. But trust is a fragile thing. Once it cracks, it's only a matter of time before it shatters completely. I started small. The next time we were all together, another dinner, another night of playing happy couples, I made a few subtle comments to Matt. Nothing too obvious, just enough to plant the seed. We were sitting outside, drinking beer while the women gossiped in the kitchen. Matt leaned back in his chair, laughing about something Daniel had said earlier. "You know," I said, keeping my tone casual, "Daniel's been spending a lot of time with Jessica lately." Matt frowned, his smile faltering just for a moment. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, taking a sip of my drink. "I don't know, just seems like they've been pretty close these days." "I'm sure it's nothing." He looked at me, his brow furrowed. "They're friends, man. We're all friends." "Yeah, of course, just thought it was interesting." I let the comment hang in the air, then changed the subject, acting like it hadn't been important. But I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes just for a second. It was enough. Over the next few weeks, I fed him more information, careful never to overplay my hand. I mentioned times when Jessica had been working late, and how Daniel always seemed to know more about her schedule than I did. I let him draw his own conclusions, let the doubts fester in his mind. It didn't take long before I noticed the tension between him and Daniel. The once easy camaraderie they had shared began to fray, and I knew I was on the right track. But it wasn't enough to turn Matt against Daniel. I needed more. I needed Jessica to feel the pressure, to start questioning everything around her, So I began working on her other friends too. Casual conversations, offhand remarks, just enough to make them wonder if something was going on behind the scenes. People love gossip, and I knew it wouldn't take much to get the rumor mill turning. I started planting small pieces of evidence where I knew she wouldn't notice right away. An unfamiliar text on her phone, a hotel receipt that I casually left on the kitchen counter. Little things that would seem like nothing on their own, but would build a narrative in her mind. She would start to feel paranoid, like someone was watching her every move, and she would be right. Meanwhile, I continued gathering more information, more proof. I followed her whenever I could, tracking her movements, documenting everything. Each time she went to see Daniel, I watched from a distance, my anger buried beneath layers of icy control. There were moments when I almost confronted them, when I imagined walking up to them mid-embrace and tearing their perfect little world apart. But I held back. It wasn't time yet. I wanted her to destroy herself first. The manipulation was easy. Jessica had become so complacent in her lies that she didn't even notice the web tightening around her. She was too busy sneaking off to Daniel's place, too wrapped up in her own deceit to see the danger looming just outside her line of sight. And the more she lied, the more careless she became. One night after she had gone out for one of her work dinners, I invited Matt over for a drink. We sat in the living room watching a game on TV, but I could tell something was bothering him. He kept glancing at his phone, his brow furrowed in that familiar way. "What's going on with you?" I asked, feigning concern. Matt sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's just, I don't know. Something's been off lately." I raised an eyebrow. "With Jessica?" He shook his head. "No, not her. It's Daniel. I don't know, man. He's been acting weird." Distant. "Yeah?" I took a sip of my drink, hiding the smile that threatened to break across my face. "You think something's going on?" Matt hesitated, then finally nodded. "Maybe. I don't want to believe it, but I don't know. Something just doesn't feel right." I leaned back, letting his words sink in. This was it. This was the crack I'd been waiting for. "You think it has anything to do with Jessica?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. His eyes flicked to mine, and I could see the doubt, the uncertainty warring in his mind. "I don't know. I hope not. But you mentioned they've been spending more time together. Do you think—" I shook my head, cutting him off. "I don't know, Matt. I don't want to think the worst, but maybe it's worth keeping an eye on things." He didn't say anything, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. Doubt was a powerful thing. It could erode even the strongest relationships, and I had just handed him a hammer. The next few days, I watched as Matt started pulling away from both Jessica and Daniel. The subtle tension between them grew, and I could see the cracks widening in their once tight bond. Jessica noticed it too. I could tell by the way she would glance at him during group outings, her eyes flickering with confusion and fear. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could feel the shift. I kept pushing, feeding Matt more bits of information, more reasons to doubt his brother's loyalty. At the same time, I made sure to distance myself from Jessica, acting cold and detached whenever we were alone. I wanted her to feel the strain, to start questioning everything around her. The paranoia was setting in, and I reveled in watching her squirm under the pressure. But it wasn't just about Jessica anymore. I had started to enjoy the power I held over all of them. The more I pulled the strings, the more I realized how easy it was to manipulate people, to bend them to my will. It was intoxicating, knowing that I controlled the narrative, that I was the one dictating their lives without them even realizing it. The line between right and wrong blurred. I knew what I was doing wasn't just about justice or revenge anymore. It was about control. About taking back the power that had been stolen from me. Jessica had thought she could play me for a fool, but now I was the one playing the game, and I wasn't going to stop until I had won. There were moments late at night when I would lie awake and question myself. Was this really the right thing to do? Was I becoming just as bad as them? But each time I pushed those thoughts away. They had made their choices. They had betrayed me. This was just the consequence. As the days passed, I could feel the tension building. Matt had started avoiding Jessica altogether, and she had grown more frantic, trying to maintain the facade of our marriage while everything around her crumbled. She was losing control, and I was watching with cold satisfaction. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Jessica looked up at me with those familiar, pleading eyes. "David, is something wrong?" I met her gaze, keeping my expression neutral. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't know. You've been distant lately? Is everything okay?" I smiled, the kind of smile that never reached my eyes. "Everything's fine, Jess. Why wouldn't it be?" She didn't answer, but I could see the fear creeping into her expression. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. And that was exactly how I wanted it. The final piece of the plan was falling into place. Soon everything would be ready, and Jessica's perfect little world would come crashing down around her. But for now, I would wait. The longer she suffered, the sweeter the victory would be. The moment I had been waiting for was almost here. It had taken weeks of meticulous planning, playing every move with precision. Jessica and Daniel thought they were clever, sneaking around like guilty teenagers. But I had been watching every step, manipulating the pieces on the board without them realizing they were the pawns. It started with the getaway. They were planning to spend the weekend together under the guise of a business retreat. Jessica, of course, never mentioned it to me directly. She had become craftier with her lies, more careful. But it didn't matter, I already knew everything. I had seen the messages, the secretive glances, and the hastily made plans. They thought they were invincible, and that was their fatal mistake. I had to time everything perfectly. Confronting them too early would give them room to wiggle out of it, to twist the narrative and make me look like the paranoid husband. I needed irrefutable proof, and not just for me. I wanted everyone to see what she was capable of, to watch her life crumble in front of an audience. I wanted her to suffer the way I had, to feel that gnawing sense of betrayal consume her. The weekend getaway would be the perfect stage. She told me she had to leave for work, and I feigned disinterest, nodding absently as she made her excuse. Inside, my mind was already moving to the next steps. I had hired a private investigator weeks ago, someone discreet, someone who could get what I needed without being noticed. The investigator had set up cameras in Daniel's cabin, hidden so well they would never suspect a thing. Every move, every touch, every kiss would be recorded. But there was more. I needed to ensure that when the truth came out, it would be in front of everyone who mattered. Jessica's social circle, her friends, our colleagues, the very people who admired her so much, they all needed to witness her downfall. I began planning a dinner party, something lavish, something she couldn't say no to. It would be a celebration, I told her, a way to thank our friends for their support over the years. Jessica was hesitant at first. "Isn't the timing a bit off?" she asked one night as we lay in bed, her voice cautious. "I have this work thing coming up, and it's fine," I said, my tone light. "We'll plan it for the weekend after. Everyone's free, and it'll be nice to get together. You've been so busy it'll be a good break for you." I watched her closely as she considered my words, and when she finally nodded, I knew I had her. She had no idea what was coming. The night of the party arrived faster than I expected. Jessica had spent the day preparing, making sure everything was perfect. She flitted around the house, directing the caterers, setting the table, choosing the right wine. Her laughter echoed through the halls as she spoke to our friends, that familiar, charming smile plastered on her face. But behind it, I saw the tension. She was nervous, anxious about her secret weekend with Daniel. It made her sloppy. I played my part well, calm, collected, the perfect husband hosting the perfect event. Matt was there too, though things had grown icy between him and Jessica. He had grown distant since I planted the seeds of doubt, and I knew he was watching her closely. She tried to engage him in conversation, to make things seem normal, but I could see it wasn't working. The cracks were starting to show. As the night wore on, I excused myself and went upstairs to my office. The private investigator had sent over the footage just hours before, and I had it queued up, ready to play. The video showed everything. Jessica and Daniel together at his cabin, their whispered conversations, their stolen moments. It was all there in crystal clarity. I connected my laptop to the home's entertainment system. Every television in the house would show the video at the same time. It would be impossible to ignore. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the culmination of everything. I returned to the party, moving through the crowd with a glass of wine in hand. Jessica was laughing with some friends near the fireplace, her cheeks flushed with a mix of wine and what I imagined was the anxiety of balancing her lies. I walked over, standing beside her, slipping an arm around her waist like nothing had changed. "Everyone's having a great time," I said, glancing around. "I think it's time for a little surprise." She looked up at me, confused. "What do you mean?" I smiled, my heart pounding in my chest. "Just a little something I've prepared. It's a tribute to us, to everything we've built together." She hesitated, suspicion flickering in her eyes. But before she could respond, the televisions came to life. The room went quiet as the video began to play. It started innocently enough, Jessica arriving at Daniel's cabin, her face nervous but eager. The sound was crisp, their voices clear as they greeted each other, their words laced with affection. Then the scene shifted. Their embrace, the kiss, the way they moved together, it was all there for everyone to see. The room erupted into gasps and shocked whispers. Jessica's face turned white, her eyes widening in horror as she realized what was happening. She stepped forward as if she could stop it, but it was too late. The truth was out. There was no running from it now. I watched her as she turned to me, her face contorted with disbelief. "David, what? How could you?" "How could I echoed, my voice calm, measured. "No, Jessica. How could you?" Matt was standing frozen, staring at the screen, his hands clenched into fists. His gaze shifted from the video to Jessica, then back to me. His face was a mask of confusion and anger, but it was clear he had no idea what to do or who to trust. Jessica stammered, her hands shaking as she reached for me. "David, I can explain. This isn't—" "Save it," I said, stepping back from her. "You've done enough." The room was chaos. People were whispering, some of them openly staring at Jessica in disgust. Her friends, the ones who had always looked up to her, were backing away as if she were diseased. I could see the judgment in their eyes, the way they recoiled from her betrayal. Matt had gone silent, his face pale, as he processed the fact that his own brother had been part of this. Jessica tried to speak again, her voice cracking. "Please, David, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "I understand that you've been lying to me for months. I understand that while I was here, trusting you, you were sneaking off to be with him. I understand everything now." She took another step toward me, tears welling in her eyes. "David, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Don't," I snapped, the anger finally breaking through. "Don't you dare try to play the victim here. You made your choices, Jessica. Now you get to live with them." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the culmination of everything I had planned. Jessica stood there, broken, her world shattered around her, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. I had won. I had exposed her for what she really was, and now there was no going back. But as I looked around the room at the faces of our friends, the horror and shock etched into their features, something inside me shifted. The satisfaction I had expected to feel was hollow, fleeting. I had destroyed her, just as I had intended, but it hadn't brought the closure I thought it would. Instead, I felt empty. Jessica collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Matt stormed out of the room, his face twisted in fury, and one by one the guests began to leave, their gazes full of judgment and pity. I stood there watching the fallout, feeling nothing but the cold realization that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The room was empty now, save for Jessica, who still wept quietly. I had wanted revenge, and I had gotten it, but at what cost? I turned and walked out, the sound of her sobs fading behind me. I left the house, the door closing behind me with a soft thud. but inside my head, it echoed like a gunshot. My hands were shaking, not from fear or regret, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The cold night air hit my face as I walked toward the car, each step pulling me further away from the chaos I just created. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt hollow. My whole body was taut, wound so tightly I thought I might snap. I opened the door to the car, sliding into the driver's seat, but didn't start the engine. I just sat there staring blankly at the steering wheel, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just done. Jessica's face, her tear-streaked cheeks, the desperation in her voice, flashed before me. For a moment, I almost pitied her, almost. But then I reminded myself of the betrayal, of the lies. She had done this to herself. Still, the emptiness gnawed at me. I ran my hands through my hair, gripping it tightly. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. I couldn't fall apart now. Not when I'd finally torn her life apart. I started the engine, the low hum of the car pulling me out of my daze. I needed to clear my head. Without thinking, I drove aimlessly through the darkened streets, watching the city lights blur by, my mind racing in circles. For weeks, I'd been consumed by one thing, exposing Jessica. Now that it was done, I was lost. What next? Where did I go from here? I stopped at a red light and glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my face pale. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. Had this been worth it? The satisfaction I'd imagined was fleeting, replaced by a crushing weight in my chest. The light turned green, but I didn't move. A car behind me honked, jolting me back to reality. I pressed the gas, feeling like I was driving through a fog. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, vibrating insistently. I glanced down and saw Matt's name flashing on the screen. My stomach tightened. I knew what this call was about, but I wasn't ready to face it. I pulled over to the side of the road, the quiet of the empty street pressing in on me. I picked up the phone, hesitating for a moment before swiping to answer. "David?" Matt's voice came through, strained, thick with emotion. "Matt," I said, my voice flat. I didn't need to say anything else. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear him breathing, heavy and labored like he'd just run a marathon. "What the hell was that?" he finally said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "That video, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking the truth needed to come out," I replied coldly. "I thought you deserved to know." "I didn't need to know like that," he shouted, anger rising in his voice. "In front of everyone, David, in front of our friends, our family." "What were you trying to prove?" "I was trying to prove that your brother isn't the saint you think he is," I snapped, my own anger flaring. "Jessica lied to me, and Daniel, he played along. They deserve to be exposed." "I get that you're angry, but this was something else," Matt said, his voice shaking. "You didn't just ruin her life, David. You humiliated her in front of everyone. What kind of person does that?" I didn't answer right away. He was right. I hadn't just destroyed Jessica. I destroyed everything around her, everything we'd built. And in the process, I'd torn Matt's life apart too. But what did he expect? A quiet conversation? A private confrontation? That wasn't enough, not for what they did. "I did what I had to do," I said after a long silence, my voice ice cold. "You didn't have to do it like that," he said quietly. I could hear the hurt in his voice. "You didn't have to take it that far." I clenched the phone in my hand, the plastic case creaking under the pressure. "You weren't the one being lied to, Matt. You weren't the one being made a fool of for months. Don't tell me what I should or shouldn't have done." Another pause. I could hear Matt struggling to find the words, but when he spoke again, his voice was different, resigned, almost defeated. "You've lost her, David. You've lost everything." "I know." I hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. I knew he was right. I had lost everything, my wife, my friends, and for what? A moment of vindication, the brief satisfaction of seeing her world crumble. It felt like a Pyrrhic victory, one that had cost me more than I could have anticipated. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had imagined this moment for so long, the confrontation, the reveal, and now that it had happened, the reality was hitting me harder than I expected. There was no going back, no undoing what I'd done. Jessica's face, pale and tear-streaked, would be seared into my memory forever. But it wasn't her pain that haunted me. It was mine. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly out the windshield, the weight of my decisions pressing down on me. In that quiet, still moment, the full impact of my revenge began to sink in. My phone buzzed again, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, expecting another call from Matt, or maybe even a message from one of our friends, but it wasn't either. It was Jessica. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at her name on the screen. I hesitated before answering, knowing this conversation would only deepen the wounds. But some twisted part of me needed to hear her voice. I pressed the button, raising the phone to my ear. "David," her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I could tell she had been crying. "Jessica," I replied, my voice cold and detached. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear her breathing, the shaky inhale and exhale of someone on the verge of breaking. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us, waiting for her to speak first. I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you." "Too late for that," I said flatly. "You made your choices. Now you get to live with them." "I didn't—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I didn't think you'd do something like this, David. I didn't think you could be so cruel." "Cruel?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Cruel is sneaking around behind my back. Cruel is pretending everything is fine while you are with him. Don't talk to me about cruelty, Jessica. You don't get to play the victim here." She was silent for a long moment, and I could hear her trying to steady her breathing. "I know," she whispered. "I deserve this. But it doesn't have to be over, David. We can still—" "It's over," I cut in, the finality of my words slicing through the tension. "You and me, we're done. There's no going back." She didn't respond immediately, and for a brief moment I thought she had hung up. But then I heard her voice, low and venomous. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" My grip on the phone tightened. "What are you talking about?" "You may have ruined me tonight, David," she said, her voice steadying. "But don't think for a second that this is the end. You've hurt me, yes. But I promise you, I'll hurt you back. You won't see it coming, just like I didn't." I sat there, stunned by the venom in her voice. The Jessica I knew, the one I thought I loved, was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone I had created through my own actions. And the worst part? I had no idea what she was capable of anymore. "Do whatever you need to do," I said, my voice a hollow echo of the man I once was. "But you're not the victim in this, Jessica. Don't pretend you are." "No," she replied, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I'm not the victim." "But neither are you, David." The line went dead. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't over. I had thought tonight would bring closure, an end to the lies, the deceit. But now I realized I had only opened a new chapter, one darker and more twisted than the one before. I let the phone fall from my hand and stared out into the darkness. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. I drove through the quiet streets, the tension in my body refusing to ease. Jessica's last words echoed in my mind over and over. "You've hurt me, but I promise you, I'll hurt you back." The venom in her voice had been unmistakable. She wasn't done. Neither was I, it seemed. The next few days were a blur. I avoided the phone calls, the texts, and the barrage of questions that followed the disaster at the party. Matt had reached out once more, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I knew what he'd say: more accusations, more disappointment. I'd torn his family apart too. But I didn't care. I had nothing left to say to him, to any of them. The emptiness grew deeper and darker with every passing hour. I thought revenge would set me free, give me the satisfaction I'd been chasing since the moment I discovered Jessica's betrayal. But now that it was done, the void it left behind was unbearable. One morning, as I sat in my office, staring at the piles of papers and documents that no longer seemed important, I realized something with startling clarity. I wasn't in control anymore. I'd been so focused on dismantling Jessica's life that I hadn't noticed how mine had crumbled in the process. Every decision I made, every move I'd taken to hurt her, had chained me to the same cycle of destruction. My phone buzzed again, pulling me from my thoughts. This time it was an email, Jessica's name glaring at me from the subject line. I hesitated before clicking it open. David, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. You're right, we're done. But I want you to know something. This isn't over. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. You've hurt me in ways I can't even describe, and now I'm going to make sure you feel the same. You took everything from me, and now I'll do the same to you. Watch your back, Jessica. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold detachment in her words sent a chill down my spine. I'd expected anger, threats even, but this was different. This was a promise. I stood up from my desk, pacing the length of the room. She was planning something, something that would destroy me the way I destroyed her. I didn't know what, but I knew it was coming. And for the first time since this all began, fear crept in. Was this what I had become? A man so consumed by revenge that I couldn't even see the line I'd crossed until it was too late? I thought back to the party, the satisfaction I'd felt when everyone saw the truth. It had been so fleeting, so shallow. Now all I felt was regret. Regret for what I'd done, for how far I'd gone. The next few days passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. I didn't leave the house. I barely ate. The isolation, once my ally in plotting Jessica's downfall, had become a prison. The silence was deafening, giving me too much time to think, to reflect on what I'd lost. Jessica's words lingered in my mind, feeding the growing sense of dread. I thought about our marriage, how it started, how we'd fallen in love. The memories were tainted now, twisted by the betrayal. But even as I replayed those moments, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd destroyed something more than just Jessica's life. I'd destroyed everything we once had. I'd destroyed myself. It wasn't long before the consequences of my actions began to take hold. Friends stopped calling. Colleagues distanced themselves. The tight-knit circle we'd once been part of had fractured completely. People chose sides and the whispers started. Some blamed Jessica for the affair. Others blamed me for the way I exposed her. Either way, I was left standing in the rubble of my own making. I spent more time alone, driving aimlessly through the city or sitting in my office, staring at nothing. Each day felt heavier than the last, the weight of my choices crushing me. I'd wanted revenge, but all I'd gained was this hollow, endless void. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of my living room, I received another email. It was from Jessica's lawyer. She was filing for divorce. I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity. Of course, I had expected it. This was inevitable, but it still hit harder than I thought it would. The finality of it, the severing of whatever fragile thread had been holding us together, made everything feel real in a way I hadn't anticipated. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I knew it was over, but part of me wasn't ready to accept it. As the days blurred into weeks, the fear I'd felt after Jessica's email never quite left me. I was always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But nothing happened. No grand act of revenge from her. No public humiliation like the one I'd inflicted. Just silence. The kind of silence that drives a man mad. I started to wonder if her threat had been nothing more than a bluff, a way to make me squirm the way I'd made her. But that didn't bring me any comfort. If anything, it made the silence more unbearable. I was waiting for a storm that might never come. It was on one of those endless, aimless drives through the city when I realized something that stopped me cold. I had been so focused on Jessica, so consumed by the need to destroy her, that I had let her control me in ways I hadn't even noticed. Even now, with everything exposed, she still had power over me. I was still waiting for her next move, still trapped in the web of deceit we had spun together. I pulled over to the side of the road, staring out at the city lights. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. The weight of everything I'd done, everything I'd lost, pressed down on me like never before. And for the first time in a long time, I let the emotions come. The anger, the regret, the overwhelming sense of loss. Tears blurred my vision, and I wiped them away angrily. I wasn't supposed to feel like this. I was supposed to be in control, supposed to be the one who walked away victorious. But instead, I was just broken. I stayed there, parked on the side of the road, for what felt like hours. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to face the emptiness that waited for me there. But eventually, I forced myself to move, to drive back to the life I'd created, the life that was now nothing more than a shell. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Jessica's divorce proceedings moved forward, and I signed the papers without protest. There was nothing left to fight for. I didn't care about the house, the money, any of it. It all felt meaningless now. One night, as I sat in my office staring at the divorce papers, I realized something that should have been obvious from the start. I had been fighting the wrong battle. I thought revenge would set me free, but it hadn't. It had only chained me to the very thing I was trying to escape. I hadn't just destroyed Jessica, I destroyed myself in the process. As I stared at the papers in front of me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe this was my chance. Maybe with the divorce finalized and Jessica out of my life, I could finally let go. I could move on. But then I thought of her last words to me. You think this is over? You think you've won? And I knew it wasn't over. Not yet, maybe not ever. The game we had played, this twisted, toxic dance of betrayal and revenge, wasn't finished. I didn't know what Jessica had planned. I didn't know when or where she would strike. But I knew she would. I could feel it. And so I waited. Because even though the war was over, the damage had already been done. And no matter how much I tried to move on, I knew one thing for sure. I would never be free. The silence that followed was deafening.